Everyone, it's Alex, and today I'm here, unfortunately, to talk about my September wrap-up. And I say unfortunately because this might be my worst reading month that I had, not necessarily because some of the books I think were bad, but I think it's namely how I was so disappointed in a lot of the books I read on the basis of having high expectations for them. Which is weird because starting off with the month, I thought it was strong whenever I read Beautiful World, Where Are You by Sally Rooney. I already did a review of this separately on my channel, but this book does follow the lives of four characters, being Alice, Simon, Felix, and Eileen. All four of them know each other to some capacity, but it mainly focuses on the exchanges between Alice and Eileen's friendship. Ultimately, what I really liked about this book is how Rooney seems to have perfected her use of dialogue in this book. And I didn't really touch on this in my review, but I do think the way in which Rooney discusses things like sex and sexuality was really well done too, in a way where often I feel like where in fiction, sex is introduced in a story to kind of use it as this way to maintain a thread within the story, kind of serving like a prop, in my opinion, as a way to service a character's way of interacting with a sense of the external, while conveniently bringing in another character to add some sort of illusion toward dimension. But in Beautiful World, Where Are You, where sex and sexuality is so constant and prevalent, it feels much more normal and organic that way. And other than that, I did find this book to be both surprising and charming and funny in some ways. But what always kept me on my toes were the characters interacting with each other, because I think Rooney importantly knows how to heighten a scene, but she also knows how to subdue it and make it tamed. So I think that's really hard to pull off, especially this blurring between what I really like in this book with just relationships in general, both the platonic and romantic. Yeah, my favorite Rooney by far, and a really great start to September initially, but if you are more interested, you can go check out my separate review of Beautiful World, Where Are You on my channel. So this month I did get a couple of galleys from NetGalley, and this one I was really excited about, being Jonahs Okay by Wieke Wang, which comes out in January 2022. Like I said, I was really looking forward to this one based on hearing great things about chemistry, which this author also wrote. But I think with Jonahs Okay, unfortunately, it's more of a me problem versus the book problem. As I would definitely say right off the bat that Jonahs Okay fits within that type of literature nowadays that's so popular with the disaffected young adult woman, which is something I would admittedly say is a type of literature that I really like, but unfortunately I just feel like I've read so much of at this point that it sort of gets lost in the shuffle for me. But Jonahs Okay is about a 30-something Chinese American woman named Joan, and based on my description earlier, as you might suspect, she is this sort of removed and disenchanted person with life, as she uses her job as a doctor to throw herself into her work so she doesn't really have to think about life too much. And I get what the book is doing by commenting on things like what it's like to be an anti-capitalist, or put value into relationships that might boil down to just based on resources like money. But the way in which the book talks about these things doesn't feel necessarily, I would say, creative. Unfortunately, it feels quite surface level in its implementation, as we spend so much time preoccupied by Joan's thoughts. Since it is from her perspective, it doesn't really give us room to budge on the flexibility of trying to interpret things at all, since it's so literal. And I guess technically with the next thing I would talk about with this book, it might be a bit spoilery, so you can just screen grab and move on to the next section of this video where you see a new book that I'm talking about. But Jonahs Okay is situated actually within the years around 2019 to 2020. So given that timeline of those years, and with Joan's occupation working in health services, you might guess that something like COVID might pop up as a storyline. So as this, I would say, second half of the book is dedicated to things like operating and getting used to what things like COVID have done to us as people and how we interact with others, and what it means to think about these ruminations on what it means to live a life, especially for Joan, as it does sort of, or the story sinks more into talking about how Joan has relationships between China and also living in the United States. So the book's fault necessarily isn't its execution, or really even its atmosphere with concocting Joan as a character. I would say instead its pitfall is that it doesn't really remain interesting to me. If anything, unfortunately, I think this book could become quite dated in maybe even like 5 years once hopefully COVID is well behind us by then. I do just wish that Wang maybe had a bit more creativity in the aspect of thinking of what is the contemporary novel with the disaffected woman or young adult woman genre. So yeah, I might try to give chemistry a chance instead at some point, but unfortunately this was a no-go for me. However, Jonahs Okay was not even the biggest offender of this reading month for me, as that definitely has to go to Transcendent Kingdom by Gyasi. So all of you that read this book and was giving it high praises, you all betrayed me, so I expect some sort of compensation in some way. This book follows a young black woman named Gifty as she's studying at Stanford University School of Medicine. And the book is structured in alternating chapters, with one being Gifty in the present day, whether working on mice experiments or managing to socialize with her white peers. And throughout all of this, we also get flickers of Gifty's past, as it really becomes evident what's haunting her is her memory with her brother's debilitating health before, unfortunately, he dies of drug-related endeavors. So what I did think was interesting and what I thought the book would focus on more was Gifty's sense of trying to crave maintaining present throughout her present-day structured life within the alternating chapters. But unfortunately, the structure of this book doesn't really service anything creatively like I thought. It felt much more just like a convenient way to tell the story, as I thought the book would allude more to Gifty's sense of guilt and possibly shame, with maybe even blaming herself with the basis of how she feels so strongly toward wanting to memorialize her brother in a way to keep him alive, primarily possibly for her own mother's sake, since Gifty is also taking care of her mother in the present day. And with Gifty's mother, she is admittedly quite suicidal, so between all of that, it makes sense that Gifty feels very strained, but I would say with all of these aspects of sorrow and grief and things like that, I do think that these make the perfect ingredients for a literary fiction novel. But with all of those ingredients, I think it's really easy to go into territory that becomes twee. And unfortunately, this story felt very twee to me, which I also didn't know, but even like a depressing twee, which I didn't know was a thing until now. I liked Gifty as a character, but I wish the book would have just focused more on her internalization of having these struggles that I didn't feel like entirely were there, or at least weren't communicated effectively, in my opinion. With these really horrible metaphors between like life and science with whatever Gifty is studying, or how Gyasi feels like she's trying to blend these chapters together because of the different structures or different basis of what the chapters are talking about, by ending each chapter, or almost all of them, by having these very sentimental gestures toward memory, which was, again, that very big sense of twee to me. And I think my biggest gripe with this book is that the writing is so surprisingly ordinary, and not in a good way, where the plain writing feels less of a device and more of just like a writing subjective viewpoint as a reader that I just didn't think was very good or that memorable. Like Gyasi's writing style I didn't feel like was very endearing to me. But I have to hand it to Gyasi because I think through her story, it's just specific enough to where it feels unique in its own way. Maybe, again, thinking of what is the contemporary novel, which I think readers can really latch on to the general sort of ideas that this book has about what it means to have or cherish memory, and how do we overcome our internal struggles or blah, 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 whatever. And how no matter what, our failures are not really failures, but just a way in which we get to know ourselves better. And all of that's fine, but I just wish I didn't have these life lessons through a novel. I wish instead that this book sort of put more emphasis on how it could remain interesting from a storytelling point of view, versus just about what the themes of the story are trying to relay to the reader. So now moving on to the nonfiction I read this month, which is a bit better than the fiction I read. but still a little lackluster. So another galley that I got from NetGalley was Carnival of Snackery by David Sedaris. And this book was a great palate cleanser for the whole month for me, in which I could read something like this after reading Transcendent Kingdom or Jonahs Okay. So that way I could feel a little more like clean slate for hoping that the next book I read is much better. So that being said, with Carnival of Snackery, I didn't really read it with the intention of, objectively trying to think if it's great or anything, because that's really hard to do with nonfiction anyway, but mainly because with Sedaris, these entries are literally diary entries, so they're literally just Sedaris' thoughts at any given time over the past 20 years. And having read a couple of Sedaris' collections before, I knew what I was getting into, and I will say that I think Sedaris is really great at really mastering his own sense of writing, and he really understands what readers expect of him, I think, as he feels like the definition of using humor as a coping mechanism, especially with what was most interesting to me in this diary collection being the year 2020 and also 2019, because of course Sedaris talks about things like COVID too, which was quite surreal. But even in doing so, Sedaris admits in these diaries that at times he was just kind of tired of it all, and he even comments on this, how especially with everything going on with the Black Lives Matter movement, as it's still relevant today, but definitely how it surged within about a year and a half ago, how he feels really conflicted by his passivity towards social action and justice. And in that way, through that example, it really reminds me of Sedaris as a writer, in a way again of how most people know him as a humor writer, how he's able to really know when to turn it on and off, so to speak. So I would say if you've never read Sedaris before, I would actually not start here. I might recommend that you pick up one of his essay collections first, but I will say Carnival of Snackery was great, sort of contextual writing as a way of me getting to know Sedaris more. It's really funny because it's a different way of getting to know him, because he already writes nonfiction, but his diaries really have this distinction, which I think is interesting. So I liked this. Again, I didn't really read it critically. Not that books have to be read critically, but it's just an aspect of reading critically that I really enjoy anyway, which you all might know if you've been watching me for a while, as that being a feature of reading that I like. Up next, I wanted to talk about Punch Me Up to the Gods by Broome, which is a memoir, as it's Broome talking about growing up in small town Ohio and then moving to Philadelphia. And with Broome, it's interesting because of his conflict with what seems like first his upbringing being this consciousness to him being a young black man, but then eventually also how he realizes he's a young black gay man. And I would say the greatest strength of this memoir is Broome's very organic sense of his memory recall, as it feels like he has that same bewilderment and wonder with really specific scenes that I really enjoyed reading about here. And ultimately how he's bewildered by this sense of comfort in the discomfort of his life. The discomfort being Broome realizing that he is kind of dealt a bad hand in life, and then his awakening to that being how he has the tools and resources to try to make his life better, hopefully by the time that he's older. Some really great examples of this is Broome recalling whenever he accidentally sets his childhood home on fire, and the other is Broome, I want to say in his young adulthood, watching two of his friends make out with each other in a car, and they're both two of his male friends, so they're in a relationship together. So it's that sort of disassociation that Broome has between watching something that he craves, but also something that he feels doesn't belong to him, primarily with how Broome's blackness he may feel prevents him from accessing desire. Meanwhile, with the first memory being about him accidentally setting his childhood home on fire, with his biological father often visiting his home without permission, it causes his father to finally leave. So it feels like this giant symbolic gesture in a good way, that it's Broome releasing his black masculinity. So it's these really specific instances where it feels like Broome in real time writing this memoir is still trying to unravel what these memories mean to him that I think is most effective. Though unfortunately, Broome feels like he starts to lose steam in some areas where he relies on really plain metaphor about like his life feeling like it's directed by someone with a script that he didn't write, which is a funny sort of comparison to make because at some points in this memoir, Broome brings up some flashbacks or memories that sound really interesting, but then he doesn't dive into them. It's that classic example of where writers may accidentally tell versus show. And I think sometimes Broome was doing this to make it sound more mysterious or endearing for the reader, but without that reward of understanding the context of the memory fully, it feels a bit cut off and makes me a bit suspicious of Broome trying to make this sort of linear structure of what his life is about up to this point. So ultimately, I would say I liked this book. I don't think it's one of the greatest memoirs I've read, unfortunately, where I think it started out stronger, but then eventually as I kept reading it, it started to sort of dip down in quality for me. As it seems when Broome is trying to crack at a sense of a unique voice through certain memories, it's whenever he decides to withhold them that he sort of stumbles and then tries to get back on track to a much more presentable version of himself, which I think is an interesting thing with memoir in general, but I couldn't stop getting that feeling that he was holding back. So I wish he would have just gone 100% in writing about everything he was thinking of while writing this memoir. And last but not least, for September, we ended actually on a high note, and that was with Real Estate by Deborah Levy. Real Estate is Levy's final contribution to her living autobiography series, and out of her 3 books, with Real Estate coming out recently, I would say Real Estate is definitely my favorite, as Real Estate to me seems to stray less from talking about writing like I feel like Cost of Living especially did, but instead Levy favors more about talking about her personal life and makes it more intimate. As Levy is getting older, she talks about this concept of real estate, which is basically an imaginary way of feeling like what does it mean with her life taking up space in the world, especially as a woman. With Levy getting older, she's also realizing she's becoming a bit more lonely now with her daughters having fully grown up, essentially. Especially now with Levy being able to reflect on her career as a writer, now kind of getting this public perception of who she is as a writer, now that she has attained this measure of feedback isn't the right word, but kind of how that blends into her personal relationships with people that she writes about here too. And with these people in her life, she writes about them really well. It's so captivating and charming. It's like I'm reading fiction in itself. So I really love her writing style and how she seems to dip in and out of creating this fun fiction throughout her real life. And of course, if you've read A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, it's kind of hard not to think about that and how with things like that that Woolf wrote, how it kind of paves the way for writers like Levy. As Levy also talks about some other writers within real estate where she feels inspired by them to essentially discover or think about who is the contemporary female character, which is also nice to think about because Levy early on does cite Elena and Leela from the Neapolitan novels, so Levy's already a good person in my book. And now through Levy's fiction, she's on this quest of trying to discover who this imaginary female woman is and what that means to be a woman in life up until now at this point. So if you're a fan of the past 2 books in this series by Levy, I have no doubts that you'd really enjoy Real Estate as well. So that does it for my September reading. Unfortunately, I would probably say my worst month of reading I've had this year. Although there are some hopefuls for October, with one being Far from the Maddening Crowd by Thomas Hardy that I plan to read for Victober, which I know is a lot of people's favorite Hardy novel. And I also got A Galley of Pure Color by Sheila Heti, and I've never read Heti before, but I'm really excited about this one, so maybe it could become a favorite for 2021. Of course, I would also love to know what you read for September. Hopefully things better than what I read. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.